stormwater and shoreline erosion assessment. My name is Kent Henderson. I'm the chair of the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain. Shortly, I'll be joined by Carrie Garvey, who is an environmental engineer with Watershed Consulting Associates. Andreas Torzo is also with WCA. He'll serve as our moderator this evening and run the show from behind the scenes. And we're also joined by our FNLC project coordinator, Pat Dene. So again, welcome this evening. This is the second of two public outreach meetings designed to inform our community members and to receive their input on new best management practices to prevent direct discharges into Lake Champlain that degrade water quality and feed blue-green algal blooms. There are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to cover before we get started. This presentation is being recorded, and we will assume that if you stay on that you are agreeing to be recorded. We need to do this so we can follow up on your questions and concerns as we select the priority projects to bring to 30% design. During the talk, you will be muted, so please enter your questions in the chat so we can recognize them at the end of the presentation, or just write them down and raise your hand at the end of the presentation, and we'll call on you after we've addressed the questions in the chat. For your reference, you'll note that there's a slide number listed on the top right corner that will help to direct our conversation. So I would like to begin our discussion by telling you what we're going to tell you. And I'll start with the project team, and we will take a minute to tell you about the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain and our working partners, Watershed Consulting Associates, and how we procured this study in 30% design grant. Project drivers, the problems that we are seeing on Lake Champlain shoreline will be described briefly. The project background and the background of the procurement of the Lake Champlain Basin Program grant by FNLC to complete the stormwater management plan for Georgia will be described. Community members noted issues along the shoreline and Georgia Shore Road in 2019. So FNLC applied for a Lake Champlain Basin program to study the area, and we were awarded a grant in November 2019 to conduct the project. If you'd like to go back to the agenda, Andres, that'd be great. Methodology, Watershed Consultants will show you this methodology and how they lead us to finding the problem areas to address tonight. Shoreline assessments, several shoreline assessments will be illustrated. Vegetative buffers, an opportunity for natural vegetative buffer establishment on private properties along the shoreline will be described. Best management practices. Best management practices in the town's right-of-way will be described to show how the landscape can be improved. Modeling and ranking, WCA will describe their modeling and ranking system of possible BMPs. And then lastly, next steps and questions. And that's when we'd like to hear your questions and comments to help direct WCA's task on designing the 3 highest priority projects. Again, as we go through the presentation, we'd appreciate it if you could put your questions in the chat or write them down, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide again. The project team, for the past 19 years, the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain has been working to reduce blue-green algal blooms in the northern arm of Lake Champlain by reducing non-point source surface runoff into the state's waterways. Our board of directors represent lakeshore residents, local business folks and farmers, legislators, and municipal employees. The directors from the town of Georgia on our board are Senator and new Select Board member Carolyn Brannigan, former Select Board member Paul Jensen, and myself, Kent Henderson. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Carrie Garvey to introduce her team.
Great. Thank you very much, Kent. As Kent mentioned, my name is Carrie Garvey, and I work for Watershed Consulting. And we're an environmental consulting company based in Burlington and specializing in stormwater management with the goal of protecting water quality. As Kent mentioned, our company was hired by Friends of Northern Lake Champlain to complete this project. And I'd also like to mention the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and that is where the grant came from for this project. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the project drivers. Kent touched on this briefly, but let's dive into it a little bit more. So the ultimate goal of the project is to identify areas where best management practices can be constructed to reduce pollutant discharges to Lake Champlain. And of course, these pollutants degrade water quality and they feed these blue-green algae blooms. So I'm sure you've heard about these blooms and maybe you've seen them near your home. And as you can clearly see from the photos on the right side of the slide, it's really a huge problem in Lake Champlain. These harmful algae blooms can pose potential health hazards for people and animals. They limit recreation, they reduce property values, they slow tourism, and they very clearly reduce aesthetics.
So in the fall of 2019, FNLC was led to the intersection of Mill River Road and Georgia Shore Road to investigate a discharge. And at that time, we recalled that the Georgia Shore Road had been left out of the Town of Georgia Stormwater Management Plan, which FNLC and Stone Environmental provided to the town in 2012. So subsequently, FNLC applied to the Lake Champlain Basin Program for an enhanced best management practice grant and was awarded $25,846 in November 2019 to study the shoreline and stormwater erosion and come up with 3 or more 30% design projects. Tonight, Watershed Consulting Associates will explain the progress that has been made on the assessment, and we'll be asking for your input on the selection of the 3 highest priority best management practices to develop to 30% design.
So if you attended the first public meeting, you probably remember me going over our methodology for the project. But for those of you who don't remember or weren't at that first meeting, I'm just briefly going to go over this again. So the Georgia shoreline spans approximately 11 miles. So it's a pretty large area to cover. So we really wanted to target our field work so that we could best use our time and really focus on those areas most at risk for water quality concerned. So several spatial data layers were incorporated into an analysis, and all that data was clipped down so that it reflected a 250-foot buffer zone along the shore of Lake Champlain. So that area corresponds to the protected shoreland area, which was established in the 2014 Shoreland Protection Act. So we looked at sensitive stream buffer areas, soils, slopes, and land use and land cover. These different factors were defined for the study area, and then they were scored based on each factor's relationship to water quality. And so those factors that have more of a negative impact on water quality were scored higher. We completed a hotspot analysis to determine statistically significant clusters of high and low values. So these were then translated into high risk and low risk zones, and the remainder were classified as moderate risk. So we completed some targeted field assessments, and we really focused on those high risk areas, and the water quality risk zones were then refined so that we could better reflect conditions that we saw on the ground. So we now have this classification for the entirety of the shoreline area, and it can be used in future projects and used to target more areas that could really use some help to benefit water quality. So we use the output of the model, as I said, to focus our field work. So last summer and fall, we made site assessments from a kayak along the shoreline. We used a drone to collect photos where we really couldn't have easy access along the shoreline. We also drove around and looked from a car and then walked around on foot. The assessments were done along Georgia Shore Road, as well as the actual shoreline area, obviously excluding private property. So we collected information about each area that was a potential problem site or an area that seemed like a good opportunity to do some stormwater or lakeshore management. We took photos and collected data about erosion, things like lack of a vegetated buffer or exposed soil. In all, we completed 25 assessments that were focused on the implementation of stormwater best management practices, or BMPs. We identified 44 areas where planted vegetated buffers or low or no mow zones could be located. And we completed 34 shoreline assessments for locations along the Georgia shoreline. So these dots represent all of these 34 shoreline assessments. And these areas were defined by changes in the water quality risk zones that I talked about, or changes in development patterns, like when a uniform residential area switches to a forested area, for example. So Georgia, like many areas in Vermont, really has a fair amount of issues along the Lake Champlain shoreline. And some of these areas are just very constrained by roads, so there's really little room for buffer vegetation. The lack of vegetation on these areas leads to erosion, especially when the shoreline areas are very steep. So you can see in this photo some pretty significant erosion in the middle area. In residential areas, the traditional lawn, even though, yes, it is technically vegetation, has very small roots and they don't penetrate very deep in the soil. So they don't provide the same stability that native plants can. So for example, this is a residential area where the native vegetation has been maintained and it's really holding the soil in place quite well. And as a clearer example, this forested stretch really doesn't have any erosion issues that we could see. So as I said, we identified 44 areas where vegetated buffers could be expanded or where landowners could adopt low mow or no mow areas, which would allow the native vegetation to grow back. There's some significant significant benefits to vegetated buffers, and these include erosion stabilization, slowing and filtering stormwater, and providing wildlife habitat. So this photo shows an example of two residential properties. One where the vegetated buffer has been cleared and replaced with grass on the right, and one where the buffer has been maintained on the left. So it's pretty clear that the erosion occurring on the property on the right is quite significant, and on the left, you really don't see the same pattern. Understandably, residents often want to clear their property to make more usable space and open up the view of the lake. But by clearing all of that vegetation, a lot of times they're really losing a lot of their property over time because it's eroding into the lake. So circling back to those 25 best management practices, or BMPs. So these are areas where stormwater practices could be installed potentially. So Kent mentioned this area. So this is the Mill River Road intersection. So this is a known problem area, and the town mentioned it as well when we spoke with them. So there's a lot of unmanaged stormwater really concentrated at this intersection, and that stormwater carries sediment and phosphorus right into Mill River, and then of course Mill River drains into the lake. So this is one of the areas where we're planning to focus some effort in designing a preliminary concept for a stormwater treatment practice. Another site of interest is the Georgetown Beach and Boat Launch and Park area. This is a site where stormwater management practices could be incorporated to improve water quality before it reaches the lake. So the two photos show areas where potential sites for future BMPs could be put into place. So in addition to the water quality benefits of these practices, this area is also very high visibility and it's a public area. And so the installation of these practices along with educational signage can really help to educate the community about stormwater and hopefully promote the adoption of practices that improve water quality on their own property. So this site's a little different. You'll notice from those two sites we just looked at that we were talking about opportunities with some open land where we could put in a stormwater BMP for treatment. However, a lot of the areas along the shore and along Georgia Shore Road are very constrained by development, and you really can't put these types of practices in the ground because there's just not enough room to do it. So the site we're looking at here is one of the sites identified where a stormwater treatment practice could be installed within the road right-of-way. The idea here is that we could use the existing swales with a filtration media like sand to clean the water before it discharges to the lake, or to detain it and let it soak into the ground naturally, depending on the type of underlying soil at each of the sites. So the site we're viewing here, the drainage area that would drain to this practice includes just over 3 acres of impervious. So that's area that's been paved, or for example, a house is there, and those areas don't allow water to naturally soak into the ground. So this site, if this practice were to be put in place, has the potential to prevent more than 4 kilograms of phosphorus from reaching the lake annually. The swale treatments, once installed, would be planted likely with grasses and would look pretty similar to what's there now. The areas would be designed to pass water through the system, and it wouldn't have standing water long term. So one of the focuses of this meeting is to talk to all of you about putting in some of these practices, because we're really looking for cooperative landowners who would like to see some of these things installed on or near their property. So especially if you have a swale area in front of your property where one of these practices could work, that would be great to know about at the end. So we really want the installation of these practices to be supported by the landowners who are adjacent to that area. And this site right here that I'm showing is an example where we have a cooperative landowner who's already made investments on their own property, and they've indicated that they're amenable to doing more. Each of those 25 practices that were shown with the dots on the last slide were modeled and ranked. And so the ranking considered factors like how much impervious cover is managed, how much phosphorus would the practice prevent from reaching the lake, what's the land availability like, and what's the stormwater volume managed, so how much water are we actually talking about. To the right, you can see a couple examples of photos of some of the stormwater BMPs that we've designed in the past. And these are similar to the practices proposed in those first 2 sites that I talked about. These practices, in addition to their water quality benefits, can also have an aesthetic appeal. You know, they don't need to be ugly, muddy holes or something like that. And They're also designed in such a way that you wouldn't have standing water for a long time, breeding mosquitoes or something like that. Looking back at those shoreline assessments, those 34 assessments were ranked so that outreach could be prioritized for the areas most in need of management. Each site was scored based on a number of factors, which are all listed on the left of the slide. The factors really focused on stability, development extent and type, native vegetation, and erosion. So each of the sites is shown on the map, ranked from most at risk in red to most stable in green. As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the Lake Champlain Basin Program awarded a grant to the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain in 2019 to complete this project. So there's no cost to the Georgia taxpayer to conduct these assessments and develop the 3 concept designs that we'll be working on soon. As the select board decides to move ahead on identified projects, the town administrator and FNLC or other watershed groups can continue to work together to procure additional grant funding. For the 3 projects where we're doing the preliminary designs, this work really puts them in good standing to get additional grants for final design and then construction. The timeline for the projects is not immediate and nothing will be constructed this year. The grant writing and approval process typically takes a few years before actual construction begins. So the earliest that work would occur would be the fall or summer of 2022, but really 2023 is more likely.
And now it's time for me to jump back in. For the rest of our time, we want to focus on the development of 3 preliminary designs for the highest priority and highly visible sites that are contributing to sediment and phosphorus runoff into the Georgia shoreline of Lake Champlain, St. Albans Bay. While this completes our formal public outreach meetings, you're encouraged to contact FNLC for an individual visit. And on the next slide, you'll see my contact information. And I really would welcome an email or a call to know more about your situation. FNLC is always looking for opportunities to continue our outreach and education efforts. And with a highly anticipated return to safer health conditions, we look forward to meeting with you on a personal basis soon. And then that leads me into the fact that I'd like to announce that we are conducting the Tyler Place event this year. We're going to do it in a virtual manner, but it is going to return on the Thursday before Memorial Day. So please check our website for the details. And we're hoping that FNLC members will be renewing their annual membership. They can hear from the Secretaries of Natural Resources and Transportation about a new project that FNLC has received $400,000 grant to do work at the head of the Deerbrook Gully in the area of the intersection of Route 7 and 104A. That will be our big release, a big information release on that project, and you're really invited to hear about that. In addition to that, we're putting on a raffle, part of our fundraising, and you may be fortunate enough to win a seat on our bird watching boat trip through the Missisquoi Delta with bird diva Bridget Butler. Also, for bikers that may be listening, you are reminded to check out our website and register for our annual Bike for the Lake event, which, following the governor's direction, we can have in a safe manner on Saturday, June 19th. Okay, so that's the end of the commercial. If we can go to the last slide, I want to thank you again for attending tonight, saving your questions. We can go to your questions now in the chat, or if you just want to raise your hand, Andreas will recognize you. And we're real excited about this portion of the program.
Yeah, and anybody that has any questions, just feel free to just chime in. I don't see anything in the chat at the moment, but if anybody has anything they want to interject, just raise your hand, and you know, we'd welcome any feedback anybody has at this point. Does anybody have any personal experiences to share in terms of living on the shoreline? Any other, you know, it doesn't even necessarily have to be these focus areas that we've been discussing. Actually, there is one question here. So from Todd, we border Minnow Brook. Are there any issues associated there? Minnow Brook, I'm not exactly sure where that is right offhand, but Carrie or Kent or Pat, you guys might have an idea. Todd, whereabouts is can you give me a landmark there?
Andreas, it'd be my understanding it's toward the southern shore.
Yeah, across from Bradley Hill Road.
Right.
So I don't have an immediate answer for you, Todd, but we can look at our analysis, you know, basically covered the entire shoreline there. And I'm not sure if you were present for the first presentation that we provided, but we've done this risk analysis. And we can definitely look at that and share that with you if you haven't seen it, because that basically has identified a number of different projects across the shoreline, and you know, several of them were down in that area, so there probably were some that were close by. So we're happy to follow up with you. Okay, and thanks. So the internet was on.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll follow up with you, Todd. Thank you.
On the shoreline assessment slide that Carrie showed, and I can't remember the slide number, but I think that there were priority areas listed or ranked. Yeah, that area there. Are there any of those dots that correspond with the area that you're asking about? I see a red dot on the southern shore.
Right, it may very well be this, you know, that the map, when we actually would get into the data, we would be able to zoom in and see exactly where that is related to the brook, where Todd's place is. And I think that would be good for us to kind of follow up afterwards and figure out exactly what the issue is there. Yeah, we'd have to blow it up he's saying we'd have to blow it up for him to see better. So yeah, given that this is just a slide for the presentation, we don't have that easily formatted. So I think that might be something easier that we can do.
Just wondering, Todd, if there's a specific issue that you know about there.
Oh, this is Todd. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, this will be a lot faster than the yeah, we've been residents for about 3 years, and last year was the first year that we had, or that we noted, a number of significant algae blooms. We had been, for whatever reason, spared or not aware in the prior 2 years we had been in the house. You know, there's farmland close by. I understand that, you know, there are certainly challenges in managing phosphorus loads there, and farmers got to eat too. I'm just wondering if there are things we can do, since our lot does border Minnow Brook, if you know anything that we can do to be part of the solution here.
Great. I'll look more into that specific area when I can look at all of the data that we have. But I would definitely encourage you to send Kent an email, and we would love to follow up with you.
Okay, terrific. And I know upstream, because I walk quite a bit in the area, that it seems like the basin that feeds Minnow Brook, there's farmland. It's very lightly used. So I would imagine that's not a great deal, but there is to the south of Minnow Brook a field that is, fairly regularly fertilized, as our noses tell us immediately. I understand that needs to occur, but if there's just anything that we can do
Mhm.
to help help manage that, help the farmer manage that, happy to help.
Great, thanks very much.
I think the other thing too is, if you do get in touch with Kent, we can direct you to, if you're looking for some options for your own home site, there's some good options in this. There's a manual that we actually helped the state produce a few years ago specifically for residents and small businesses related to stormwater. And it just gives some really good homeowner type things that can be done on your land to stabilize the land, to infiltrate stormwater, to spread it out, to design a rain garden, that kind of thing, all with some, like basic concepts and graphics and stuff, and we can point you to that as well.
All right, very good. I will reach out to Kent.
Yeah, that'd be great, Todd. I know that Pat Dene and I went down and visited with a resident on the shore in that area. And it's been 2 summers ago now, and we actually brought the Lakewise folks down and tried to work on his shoreline assessment or erosion issue. The previous landowner had really done a number on any shoreline vegetation, and then the new property owner was suffering the consequences. But we worked with them to try to bring in a vegetative solution, and we were happy to go there and work with that in that situation.
Very good.
There we go. One question that came through: how is Shoreline Protection Act helping improve water quality? Is enforcement happening? Are the rules being followed by many people? And that is enforcement happening? Are the rules being followed by many people? Personally, I would love to get the state folks, their impressions on that question. I don't actually have a good sense of that, because I'm not really plugged into the enforcement piece. Kent, I don't know if you've gotten any feedback on that at all either. I imagine it's probably hit or miss. A tough thing, obviously, to enforce, and also a rule that is relatively new that people are still kind of learning and understanding, right? So I think it's probably variable, is my guess, but I actually don't have any good data on that.
I really don't have anything to add to that. We really don't get into the regulatory arena on a regular basis, and I wouldn't have any way of judging.
And the next question: what type of mitigation is planned for Georgia Shore? Looks like in Mill River runoff. So I think the question is focused right around maybe where Mill River comes in there, and the sediment plume, or the delta that's being built there. So I can just take a stab. Yes, yeah. So that's one of the projects that we have there. I mean, although it's not specifically in that delta area, it is focused on the Mill River, and it's focused on mitigating the runoff that's draining currently into the Mill River and actually creating some pretty significant erosion. And so, that project is one of our identified high priority areas, which should help mitigate that problem. However, there is, our project is really focused on the lakeshore itself and not necessarily all of the upland areas that actually contribute to the Mill River. And so, in terms of really mitigating the overall sediment load that's coming through the Mill River into the lake, I mean, we're trying to address it to the extent kind of more of the lakeshore areas are contributing, but not necessarily all of those upland areas. And so, there is going to have to be additional work, I think, to fully mitigate that issue.
Yeah, I
And you
would
got-
just
go
add,
ahead.
that the project that we're looking at kind of in that Mill River Road area is a piece of the Mill River puzzle, which is a pretty large puzzle. I think it's an important area where there is a fair amount of sediment and phosphorus entering Mill River, pretty close to where it drains into Lake Champlain. So it's an important project, but it certainly isn't going to solve all of the issues related to that river. But hopefully there'll be other projects, focused more on that upland area of the watershed.
There are actually several problems with the Mill River that are identified in the Georgia Stormwater Management Report that I referenced that was done in 2012. There are some bridges and there are some cave-ins along the roads that have not been addressed yet. And in fact, our project coordinator is working with Northwest Regional Planning now to bring attention to some of those issues. So it's something that we're looking at, but that's a really tough river in that there's so many collapsing stream banks along that river, and there's been so much development beside it that it's going to take a major effort.
And kind of along the lines of that, one of the questions was, I believe you had mentioned 3 first projects. Could you explain more about these, the areas, et cetera? So maybe a little more detail about each one of the projects.
Yeah, so just to kind of recap what we were talking about with those 3 projects. So the grant that we're working under is allowing us to develop 3 30%, which are a concept level engineering plan for a stormwater practice for 3 sites that were identified and ranked in this process. So those 3 sites have not been finalized yet, but the ones that we are looking at more closely to hopefully develop a design for would be that Mill River Road intersection area, the Georgia Town Beach, and then one project along Georgia Shore Road, one of those projects in the road right-of-way that I was talking about. So that location hasn't been finalized yet. But that's something that we're working on in the short term to really iron out those details and come up with those concepts.
Great. Anybody else? Anybody have any other comments or questions that they'd like to ask? Kent, or Pat, any other follow-up words from you?
Yeah, like this is our chance to talk with our residents. I got a phone call after the last presentation that led me down to the site that Carrie described in detail, the picture with the swale, and then there was a red barn behind it. I got a call from those landowners about that site, and we went down and we talked about it. And I would welcome another call like that in the near future, because we want to complete this project, and we really want to pinpoint this last project along the right of way. So if there are other landowners along Georgia Shore Road that would like to have our involvement, we'd sure like to. If you don't want to speak out tonight at a public meeting, that's fine. But if you'd like to email me and let me know about it, or give me a call, I'd be happy to go down just like I did at that property.
So I see that there's a question about what does a 30% design mean? And thanks for asking that. I'm afraid that's a bit of jargon that sometimes forget that people don't know what that means. So what a 30% engineering design is basically a preliminary design. So what that does is it kind of proves out the engineering feasibility of doing a project. So can you get the water to the practice? How big is the practice going to be? How's the water going to get out of the practice? What type of media might you need in there? And all of those specifications, a planting plan, if it's a planted practice, things like that. So the way that this process usually works is you develop this concept level plan, and then that plan is something that you can take to, for example, the state, say that they were going to fund a project through their Clean Water Fund or the Lake Champlain Basin Program, who again are the ones that funded this study. So you can take that concept level plan to them and say, like, look, we proved out that this project can work. Here are the benefits associated with it. Here's how much phosphorus this project could prevent from reaching the lake. And here's how much roughly it's going to cost. And then you can apply for a grant to cover the final design of the project. So that's really ironing out all of the details that you need to do. And then from there, usually you would go through that process again, but with your final design. And then you would apply for funding to actually put it in the ground. So to hire a contractor and to get the materials that you need and the equipment and all that sort of stuff. So I hope that answers that question. And if that's not clear, please let me know. I'm happy to answer any other specific emails about that.
One other question that's come in: when new development is being planned along the lake, what can be done at the town planning level to help prevent water quality issues caused by this new development?
So I can add some stuff and then you guys can chime in as well.
Yeah.
But there's a couple things. One of which is the Shoreline Protection Act. So if it is right on the lake shore, then the Shoreline Protection Act would definitely come into play there. And that act has quite a bit in it, but really the goals of it are to protect the lake and keep that native vegetation in place. And then if it's a bigger development, there is stormwater permitting from the state. I'm not sure if there are any town ordinances specifically. I think Kent might be able to address that.
Actually, I think there's a longtime member of the Planning Commission that's a participant tonight that would certainly have a lot more information than I would. And that's where I'd go, as I'd go to the Town of Georgia Planning Commission and speak with one of their members to get more information about what the municipal would do.
Okay, and then actually somebody's Matt here is looking for the email for a site evaluation. So I think we could give our email directly or to Kent. I guess either way would be fine. I think the email that's up on the screen right now is Kent's. You can see that still. So I think you could get in contact, and I think then we would be happy to arrange an on-site evaluation.
Mm-hmm. I think I had it on a different slide when he asked the question.
Oh, gotcha.
I apologize for that long email address. I inherited it. I did not create it.
Great. Any further questions or comments on? Okay, Kent, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, okay. I think we've had a nice opportunity. I hope that we were able to provide good information about what we are trying to accomplish, and we're trying to do this so the town has some information as they move ahead with their planning on stormwater issues. Thanks again for your participation tonight, and you are very welcome to send me any questions by email. The designs are going to happen soon, so we really don't have much time before Carrie and Andreas go to work on the designs. So I'd encourage you to get back to us shortly. I think that's it for us tonight. Again, thanks for attending, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you at some of our events this summer. And good luck to you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
everybody.